Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us. Today, we're going to be looking at Goodbye, Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. This book is by Elisabeth Braw, and it really dives into this idea that globalization as we knew it, well, it's kind of fading away, and we're moving towards a world that's more divided.
It uses some really compelling arguments, and it uses these real stories of people and companies to show us, how this shift is actually happening.
It's interesting because it's not just theory. It's really looking at how these big forces in the world, are impacting people, real people. Maybe before we jump into the book itself, we should talk a bit about Elisabeth Braw, give our listener a little background.
Yeah, definitely. So Braw is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and she focuses on defense and foreign policy, and she's also a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. She also contributes to a bunch of other publications, too.
So she's got some serious, expertise in this area, where global politics and economics kind of come together.
Let's jump in. Chapter 1 throws us back to a time before globalization really took off. And it's really interesting because it felt like a different world.
Yeah, it was like a different planet. Braw uses this example of this Swedish telecom giant called LM Ericsson, and this is back in the 1980s. And at the time, they were considered a global company, but their operations were really limited to these small little areas around the world.
Can you imagine trying to do international business back then?
That must have been so difficult. Travel and communication were so much harder.
And the book talks about these companies having very limited reach, and they use this metaphor of islands.
Oh, that's a good way to put it, because it really shows how much more disconnected the world was.
Especially compared to today.
And there were also a lot of political barriers that were in place at the time. Things like the Warsaw Pact and the Iron Curtain. The Warsaw Pact, that was that military alliance led by the Soviet Union, kind of like their version of NATO.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Iron Curtain, that wasn't just a wall.
No, it wasn't.
It was more like this whole system of control that really limited contact between the East and West.
It's hard to imagine that level of separation now.
It really is, especially in today's world.
Yeah. It's important to remember that context, because then in Chapter 2, the book takes us into this dramatic rise of globalization. It uses the career of this guy named Carl-Henrik Sundström as an example. He was working at Ericsson, and he was like climbing the corporate ladder so fast.
It's pretty amazing when you read stories from that time about people like him.
Yeah.
It's like promotions left and right, job opportunities exploding. It seemed like there was just so much possibility.
It must have been really exciting to be a part of it all. And there were some major events that kind of fueled all this change. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a huge symbolic moment. It felt like it broke down that division between East and West. And then China. China's economy opened up.
That was massive.
It was a huge game changer.
For the whole world.
And on top of that, technology was changing so quickly, making communication and travel much easier. All of this together created this huge sense of optimism about globalization.
Everyone thought globalization was going to make everything better.
It did seem that way at the time.
More trade would mean more wealth. It would bring countries closer.
And even reduce the risk of war.
It was like this new era of peace and prosperity.
It really felt that way. But, of course, things get more complicated.
Oh, they do.
As we'll see.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. Chapter 3 is called Winners and Losers, and it starts to show us that the impact of globalization wasn't all good.
Yeah, it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Some people benefited a lot, but others got left behind.
The book contrasts these two experiences. On one hand, you have this guy named Michael Treschow, a really successful businessman who thrived in the globalized economy.
He saw these opportunities.
And he took them.
Yeah. But then you had this other guy, John Speller.
Oh, yeah. He was a British member of parliament.
And he represented a district that was really reliant on manufacturing.
And he was seeing firsthand how globalization was leading to factories closing.
Yeah, and jobs disappearing.
It was a real wake-up call to the downsides of globalization.
Yeah, and Braw brings in other examples, too, like the closure of the KKW Greifswald nuclear power plant in Germany.
Oh, right.
After reunification.
That caused so many job losses.
It did. And then she contrasts that with the success of Nokia in Finland.
Yeah, Nokia really took off during globalization.
So it's this picture of how globalization played out so unevenly.
Yeah, creating winners and losers, and in some cases, really stark ways. This is going to be a major theme in the book.
Uneven impact.
It sets the stage for the backlash against globalization that we see later on.
Now, in Chapter 4, Braw explores some of the major events that really started to shake people's faith in this idea of a globalized world.
Like what kind of events?
We're talking 9/11, the Enron scandal,
Oh.
and of course the 2007-2008 financial crisis.
Each of those was a huge shock to the system.
They really rattled the world.
9/11 especially led to so many more security measures.
Yeah,
And it made people feel really vulnerable, like in a way they hadn't before.
that interconnectedness
Yeah.
that we had all been celebrating suddenly felt a lot more fragile. And then Enron, which is this massive corporate fraud.
Oh, yeah. That made everyone question these big global businesses.
It felt like nobody was playing by the rules.
And no one was being held accountable.
Right. And then the financial crisis hits.
Yeah.
And that was like the final blow.
It revealed how unstable the global financial system really was.
People lost their homes, their jobs, their savings.
It felt like the whole world was falling apart.
It really did.
Yeah.
And Braw talks about how these complex financial instruments, these derivatives, played a key role in the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, derivatives. Those are complicated.
They are. I mean, for our listener who might not know, derivatives are basically bets on the future value of something.
It's like betting on whether a house price will go up or down.
Right. But way more complicated with much higher stakes. And when those bets went bad, it triggered this chain reaction and the whole system crashed. And it wasn't just about economics. Braw also talks about how the financial crisis really eroded trust.
Oh, yeah.
There was this feeling that these bankers, they gambled with everyone's future.
And they got away with it.
It fueled so much anger,
And resentment.
which, as we'll see, really plays a role in this backlash against globalization.
Yeah.
So now, let's look at a very specific example of globalization. The world of mobile phones.
Oh, that's a good one.
Chapter 5 dives into this fierce competition that was happening in this industry.
It really was a battle for dominance.
Nokia was huge at the time,
But then smartphones came along.
and it was a whole new game.
Everyone was trying to adapt
Yeah.
and innovate.
Braw talks about Ericsson again. You know that Swedish company we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
They actually partnered with Sony,
To form Sony Ericsson,
a classic globalization move.
joining forces to compete globally.
Meanwhile, Motorola. They were struggling to keep up with Nokia. But this chapter isn't just about the business side. Braw highlights how mobile phones were changing societies, especially in developing countries.
Yeah, she uses the example of Ghana,
Oh, right.
where mobile phones gave people more privacy and access to financial services.
It was a real game changer for some communities.
It was.
So it shows how globalization and technology could have a positive impact.
It wasn't all bad,
Not at all.
but now we need to talk about the elephant in the room.
China.
Exactly.
Chapter 6 focuses on China.
It really marks a turning point in the book,
It's all about China's growing power.
both economic and political.
Braw tells this story of this guy, Mo Ibrahim, who was trying to raise capital
Ugh.
for his African telecom venture,
What was it called?
Celtel. And he had so much trouble getting funding,
Really?
while at the same time, Chinese companies were getting tons of support from their government.
It really highlights the tension between China's state-directed capitalism and the West's free market approach.
And so basically, with state-directed capitalism, the government picks winners and losers in the economy.
They support specific companies and industries,
It's very hands-on.
very different from what we see in the West.
And this started raising concerns in the West about things like intellectual property and the growing trade imbalance between China and the West.
You could feel the tension building,
It could, yeah.
and all of that really comes to a head in Chapter 7.
Which is all about Huawei.
The Chinese telecom giant.
This was a major flashpoint.
Between China and the West.
Huawei was making huge strides in 5G technology.
And Western governments started to worry,
They were worried about security risks.
specifically the possibility of a backdoor.
A backdoor.
Yeah.
Can you explain that for our listener?
Basically, it's a hidden vulnerability that would allow someone, maybe the Chinese government, to access sensitive data or even control the network.
That's scary. It became a huge debate.
It did.
Some countries banned Huawei outright. Others tried to find ways to mitigate the risks.
But it was really about distrust between China and the West.
This feeling that their interests were just fundamentally different.
It showed how national security was becoming intertwined with economics.
It wasn't just about business anymore.
It was about geopolitics.
That's a trend that we see continuing today.
Yeah, it is.
And it ties into this broader backlash against globalization that Braw explores in Chapter 8.
So this wasn't just about China.
No, it wasn't. It was happening all over the world.
There was the Brexit vote in the UK.
Right.
and Donald Trump's election in the U.S. and the rise of populist movements all
Are
over.
skeptical of free trade and global integration.
It was a big shift in the political landscape.
And Braw looks at the reasons behind it all. This growing sense of inequality.
This feeling that globalization was only helping the elites.
And that ordinary people were getting left behind.
And then there were the job losses from offshoring.
Right. Where companies move jobs to countries with lower labor costs.
It's important to remember that globalization has both benefits and drawbacks.
And those drawbacks were becoming more and more visible. And this backlash against globalization, it sets the stage for what comes next.
The even bigger changes.
The return to a more divided world.
Exactly.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Row's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you.
Picking up where we left off, Chapter 9 really shows how China was starting to flex its muscles on the world stage. It wasn't just about economic power anymore. They were using that power to really influence global affairs.
It was a pretty big shift. Braw gives examples like the militarization of those islands in the South China Sea, remember? That caused a lot of tension with neighboring countries and with the U.S.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And then there was the trade war with Australia, too. China really used its economic leverage to punish Australia for political disagreements.
Yeah, it was pretty intense.
Yeah.
The book talks about things like, Western businesses being kicked out of Guangdong province. And the ban on Australian wine imports, too. Those were some pretty clear signals, right? That China was willing to use its economic power to get what it wanted politically.
It was definitely a move away from the more cautious approach they had in the past. They were like way more confident and willing to kind of challenge the existing world order.
Yeah, it felt like a real turning point. And then, of course, the pandemic hits.
Oh, yeah. COVID. A total game changer.
Right. In Chapter 10, Braw really dives into how the pandemic just exposed all these vulnerabilities, like, how interconnected and fragile the world had become.
Suddenly you had all these disruptions to supply chains, travel restrictions everywhere, and of course the global economic downturn. I mean, it was a huge wake-up call.
Definitely. And Braw also points out how the pandemic really highlighted the lack of global cooperation. Everyone was kind of scrambling to figure things out on their own.
Yeah. It felt like every country was for themselves, and there was a lot of blame going around. Not a lot of, helping each other out.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And it really hurt trust between nations. China especially got a lot of criticism for how they handled things at the beginning. So it really just added to this feeling of the world like splitting apart.
It's like all the cracks were already there, and the pandemic just, blew them wide open. It made it all so much worse.
And then Chapter 11, A New Iron Curtain, really focuses on that, like this escalation of tension between the West and China.
Braw uses this example of Lithuania, remember? They allowed Taiwan to open an office in their capital city, Vilnius. And China got so mad.
They did. They saw it as like a direct challenge to their one China policy.
And they didn't just get mad, they retaliated big time. They tried to use their economic power to punish Lithuania, basically.
Yeah, it was a small country standing up to a superpower. It was, it felt like a David and Goliath story almost. But it also showed how risky it was to go against China.
Absolutely. And that chapter also talks about friendshoring, like how businesses were starting to look for different suppliers, not just the cheapest option anymore.
Right. They wanted suppliers in places that were like more politically aligned, even if it meant higher costs.
It was about reducing their dependence on China, spreading the risk a bit more, which makes sense in a world that feels, so uncertain.
Totally. And then, just when you think things can't get any crazier, war breaks out in Europe.
Yeah. Chapter 12 talks about the lead up to Russia invading Ukraine and the whole world's response. It really felt like, the end of an era.
It did. Like all those hopes we had after the Cold War that, large-scale conflict was over, it all just felt so naive.
Right. And then the sanctions hit Russia and a lot of Western companies pulled out. It was a huge shift. Like we were moving into this new period of instability where, I don't know, anything felt possible.
It was pretty unsettling. Braw talks about the economic fallout from the war and how it really showed that globalization didn't automatically mean peace and stability.
Right. Those big power rivalries never went away. They were just simmering under the surface.
And, the whole thing really highlighted Europe's dependence on Russian energy, which is a whole other issue.
Yeah, that was a big wake-up call. It forced countries like Finland to look for different energy sources, to become more independent.
Right. So you have all this going on, war in Europe, tension with China. But then Braw introduces this new element, Generation Z.
Yeah. Chapter 13 is all about how Gen Z is like stepping up and making their voices heard.
It's pretty inspiring. They grew up in the digital age, and they're just like way more aware of social and environmental issues than maybe older generations were at that age.
And they're not just aware, they're doing something about it. Braw talks about how they're leading boycotts against companies, those operating in Russia or China. They want ethical sourcing, sustainable practices. It's a whole new level of activism.
It is. It's like they're not just consumers, but active citizens shaping the world they want to live in.
And it's a good reminder that even in a world that feels really divided, there's still this desire for, global cooperation, for people to work together to solve these big problems.
Right. So finally we get to chapter 14.
The return of a divided world.
Yeah. It's like the culmination of everything Braw has been talking about, this picture of a world that's moving away from globalization as we knew it. It's more fragmented, more unpredictable.
And way more challenging. She really argues that these forces pushing us towards deglobalization, they're strong, really strong.
It's kind of a sobering message.
Yeah. It's not a happy ending, exactly. But I think what she's doing is urging us to be realistic, We have to acknowledge what's happening and then figure out how to deal with it.
Right, to be proactive.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, I think, the book really wants us to think about the future. It's not just about looking back. It's about, how do we move forward?
It's not about wishing things were different. It's about accepting how things are and then figuring out what to do next.
Yeah. And one of the biggest things for me is how businesses need to change their strategies. That old way of doing things, relying on cheap manufacturing in other countries, it's just too risky now.
It's not just about the lowest cost anymore.
No, it's about being able to adapt.
Governments need to adapt too.
They need to rethink how they approach trade and investment. Even national security, it's all connected now.
It's way more complicated than it used to be. And I think Braw's book really helps us understand all that complexity.
It does. One thing she says is that we need to stop thinking about globalization as just good or bad. It's not that simple.
There are good things about it and bad things about it. We need to see both sides.
Exactly. It's about finding a new balance, a better way to do things, not getting rid of globalization altogether, but, making it work better.
And Gen Z, I think they're a big part of that.
They are. They're already changing things.
They're pushing companies and governments to, actually deal with those social and environmental problems.
More transparency. More accountability.
It gives you hope, right, to see them taking action.
It does. It shows that change is possible.
But the book, it does end on a kind of serious note.
Yeah, Braw doesn't pretend that everything is going to be easy. She says there are real challenges ahead.
But she also emphasizes the importance of, keeping those lines of communication open.
Yeah, even if the world is more divided, we still have to work together. We all live on the same planet, after all.
Right. So as we finish up, what do you think is the most important thing we learned from Goodbye Globalization?
I think just acknowledging that globalization, like we used to know it, it's over. That's a big deal. But it also means we have a chance to do things differently, to learn from the past.
Yeah, to build something better, more resilient, more fair.
Exactly. And to find new solutions to those global challenges. It's not about going backward. It's about going forward, but in a smarter way.
I totally agree. So to our listeners, we really recommend checking out Goodbye Globalization. It's such an insightful book, and it will really make you think.
It's a great read, and Braw's writing style is really engaging, so it's not a difficult book to get through. It's thought-provoking for sure, but in a good way.
Well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.